Dead Flowers by the Rolling Stones. When you're sitting there in your silk up holstered chair, talking with some rich folk that you know, I'll be in my basement room with a needle and a spoon and another girl to take my pain away. Take me down, little Susie, take me down. I know you think you're the queen of the underground. You can send me dead flowers every morning. Send me dead flowers through the mail. Send me dead flowers at my wedding, and I won't forget to put roses on your grave. No, I won't forget to put roses on your grave. Thank you, Stones.
Good. Hello everybody, welcome to you all. My name is Chris, I'm from Victoria, so if I get things wrong, forgive me, I'm only a Victorian. And we're going to have an acknowledgement of country. There is Cara and Alan.
Good morning, everyone. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and the Turrbal people of this area. We acknowledge their continuing connection to land, air and waters. While no treaty exists, they have never ceded their sovereign rights. They are the true custodians of the land. We acknowledge their frontier wars, their fallen warriors, and their elders, past, present, and emerging. This acknowledgement is a combination of words from a young First Nations woman in Brisbane, Murray Johnson, and from a government publication on The Voice. Thank you.
We're going to hear now from Robert, better known, I gather, to everyone as Robert Perrier. And thanks, Chris.
I first met Peter in 1970 in a small office at the University of Queensland. He was 40 and a philosopher. I was 20, worker from Zilmia. Peter spoke words I didn't understand, quoted thinkers I'd never heard of, contemplated futures I couldn't imagine. I was awestruck. In my mind, he was a giant. I didn't meet him again until he was in his early 80s. This time, I met a human being, no less knowledgeable, erudite, or philosophical, but more fragile, more vulnerable. A man of stories, prone to parables, sometimes spiritual, often humorous, always apt. I also encountered a man troubled by a past he could not forget and another he could barely remember. He had fleeting memories of childhood and adolescence, but no confidence they could be trusted. Together, the picture they created was of a lonely, isolated little boy. Having researched my own family history, I knew the shortcuts. With Peter's blessing, I set about to find out as much as I could about his background. The Australian Wertheims were descendants of the famous manufacturers of pianos and sewing machines. Peter's grandfather Hugo began business as an importer. In 1908, he had enough resources to build a factory of his own on a 4-acre block in Richmond. There, he manufactured local pianos using Australian timbers and designs. At its peak, he employed 2,000 workers. Peter's parents grew up in the period known to Victoria as Marvellous Melbourne. His mother was Marjorie Felstead. The Felsteads were at the centre of Melbourne high society. Their Toorak mansion and gardens were regularly used to hold elaborate parties for governors, politicians and celebrities. Much of the family's wealth came from the rag trade. Up to her death in 1956, Marjorie was renowned for her elegant fashion choices, appearing regularly in the social pages of local newspapers. Peter's father, Rupert, was nicknamed Sauce, short for sausage due to his German heritage and his beanpole physical appearance. A Melbourne University newspaper described 6'4" Rupert as resembling, in some respects, the Eiffel Tower, and in others, a bottle of pickles. Rupert was a war hero serving as captain of the Australian Intelligence Corps stationed in Germany. Also a renowned sportsman. He played in the 1922 Australian Davis Cup team against the US. After the tournament, he travelled Europe with childhood friend and university comrade Guido Baracci. On their return from Europe, Rupert formed a stockbroking partnership while Guido took the road less travelled and set up the Communist Party of Australia. Marjorie and Rupert's marriage was Melbourne's wedding of the year. Youngest of 3 boys, Peter was born in 1928. Peter hardly knew his father as a father. A year after Peter was born, Rupert spent 2 years in hospital suffering from tuberculosis. Defying doctors' orders, he left the hospital and returned to work. A year later, he collapsed in the city and died. It was 2 weeks before Peter's 5th birthday. 8 months prior to her husband's death, Marjorie spent 11 months in Europe. During this time, Peter was sent to a prep boarding school in Healesville. He retained one clear memory of his time there. He had been isolated because he'd been naughty. Other kids were forbidden to talk to him. He remembered the kindness of a small girl who defied the order and did. Following his father's death, Peter was enrolled in Melbourne Grammar, joining his brothers John, aged 10, and Michael, aged 7. When Peter was 10, Marjorie took another extended holiday to Europe, during which time Peter boarded at Geelong Grammar. Soon after Marjorie returned, tragedy struck the family again. Michael, the middle son, fell from a bolting horse and died. In his early teens, Peter also contracted TB, as his father had. He was sent to a place in the Blue Mountains run by nuns. He returned to Geelong to finish his education, but had to be removed again due to the TB. Up until 1950, he was then in and out of hospital, including 2 stints in the notorious Greswell Sanatorium, which often used TB patients for medical experiments. But at Greswell, he also met someone who would change his life. The brilliant philosopher and ethicist Max Charlesworth. Max and his wife Stephanie were hugely influential in some of Peter's most significant life choices. They remained lifetime friends. This is my favourite t-shirt. It was designed by Peter. The words are from Lao Tzu. They say, "For knowledge Add something every day. For wisdom, subtract. With his vast mind, Peter had no trouble adding knowledge every day, nor did he have trouble refining that knowledge into bite-sized chunks of wisdom for anyone privileged enough to listen. What Peter struggled with was neither knowledge nor wisdom. It was a discomforting feeling, the feeling of isolation he first felt as a child and continued to feel throughout his life, which he interpreted as abandonment. Now he's at rest, on the great adventure. Go well, dear one, and at peace. This is a song that Peter really, really loved. Well, it could have been autumn, it could have been spring. Time is a loser's thing. Be still, breathe it in. You never know what it may bring. Well, it could be insight from Klein or Freud. It could be tears, it could be joy. Some things you cannot avoid. All that's held, all that's held must be destroyed. So forget the maybes and forget the when. Do all you can to make amends. It won't be over until it's the end. You cannot lose, you will not lose if you do not contend. I fell into your magic spell. You took me to the deepest well. It was so deep I couldn't tell if it was real or fictional. Well, it may be in the autumn, or it could be in the spring. Time isn't a loser thing. Be still, breathe it in. You never know what it may bring. You never know what each moment brings.
The topic is Peter in Melbourne. It's very much confined to Peter at the University of Melbourne, which is what I knew about. I would have met Peter in early 1960 after attending a Newman Society summer school for new students at the University of Melbourne. Like a wide-eyed young football fan admitted to the company of the top team, I was dazzled by a group of older men sick, who offered a vision of the university and of intellectual life, linked with a view of Catholicism, far more exciting than what I had been raised on. And Peter Wertheim was one of these, but different. The background to this was in the 1950s, and some of it already happening when Peter arrived at the university. And as we've just heard, Peter met Max Charlesworth when they were both in the sanitarium. Conversations with Max stimulated Peter's interest in Catholicism and in university study of philosophy. So he went to Newman College to live, where he shared a room for several years with Jim Bowler, later of late Mungo fame.
Jim wrote recently of his enduring friendship with Peter and of these years of growth. We came to know and share much of each other's lives in that engaging process. And he commented on Peter's enduring wit and creative energies, and they've remained in friendly contact ever since. Peter became involved with a branch of the Human Society that called itself, somewhat pretentiously, as Margaret and Tony Cody have commented, the Intellectual Apostolate, and often contributed talks at conferences and the like. Max was more reserved about all that, but Peter stayed good friends with him. Also, of course, his wife Stephanie and her brother Greg Armstrong, also an academic. And I'm not sure whether Greg's son Hugo is here. Possibly. Welcome anyway. And there are several other people from Melbourne who sent greetings, etc., but we'll take that as given. Now, poet and Professor Vincent Buckley has a few pages on Peter in his memoir, Cutting Green Hay. I don't agree with all of what he says there, but a line that's caught my eye was a comment on Peter's athleticism. I can still visualise the grace with which he could spontaneously move when the mood took him. And I have a particular memory of one of the summer schools that we kept having. There was a makeshift game of cricket going on out in the middle of a sort of makeshift oval, open space, and there was music playing as often. Peter, while the cricket was going on, Peter was doing that kind of prance around the edges of things. And he was just prancing around, doing his thing. Suddenly the cricket ball landed in Peter's hand. Peter just caught the catch, didn't stop, just kept going on, tossed the ball back. It was a very memorable example of athleticism and grace. Right. So among the items, there's a memoir from Margaret and Tony Cody that will be available to read. Haven't got time for it now. And some of it is about Peter's part in university politics, which you can also, if you're interested, check out for yourselves. And it's very insightful about Peter's character and personality. I'm having a bit of trouble with the light here. Peter was distinctive in that circle, though, by being a non-drinker. Other more than made up for the quota on that one. Yet in the right mood, he could be the absolute life of the party. It was quite remarkable. And an outsider might say, well, he's the one who's willing and hitting it, but no, he was doing. You won't be surprised to know that Peter could offer hilarious impromptu comic acts. And plays on words. Oh, he loved plays on words, doing funny voices, etc. Because for all that perhaps at the time I didn't realise there was the others, inevitably the darker side of moods beside all that quality. And Peter was also the one who would worry away at an issue. He'd get his worry over it. Cody has quoted another friend, Hugh Lacey, recently, remembering how Peter could kindly but firmly push him to question things he was saying that Peter felt should be thought through more carefully. And many of us could have done with more of that, I must say, including me. And that ability, I'm sure, made Peter an excellent teacher. Hang on a minute. Peter was involved with a journal called Prospect that emerged from that Catholic circle and pushed more towards what we might now roughly call the left of the editorial members, some of whom were rather caught up with fears of the communist threat. Also, according to Cody's, Peter was involved with founding Dissent, a more secular leftish journal. And along with all this, Peter continued his studies in philosophy, which I know a lot about, effectively enough to get a position at the University of Queensland, which began his long connection with this part of Australia. Now, just a quick personal footnote. We went separate ways around 1965. He came to Queensland around then, I went to Canada. It was a delight to reconnect about 12 years ago, and we met 2 or 3 times a year when I came to Brisbane. And I continued to enjoy his wonderful blend of wit, whimsy and wisdom. And I think that few who made that ultimately how I came to be chairing this today. You won't go into that. I think that few who reached Peter's age could match his continually searching mind right through his distinctive and inspiring engagement with social issues, with ideas, and above all, with people of all ages. So it's over now to Dan O'Neill, Peter's comrade and friend for many years.
Chris has just told us that he met Peter at a Newman event in 1960. That's the year that I met Peter, because a group of fellow students and I travelled down to Melbourne to the 1960 Australian Student Labour Federation Conference. And I remember sleeping on the floor in the kitchen of Peter and Barbara's house. I think it was in Carlton. But when I woke up in the morning, I saw a man sitting at a small table marking students' essays with one hand while feeding bits of banana to 3 little kids who were queuing up with the other hand. That was my meeting with Peter, and then later on at a party in which he was one of the few people not drinking. But he struck me immediately as a quite spectacular and remarkable person, incredibly witty and intelligent. I didn't see Peter again until 1965, when I came back from studying in England, to find, to my delight, that Peter had been employed the year before in the philosophy department at the University of Queensland. That was the beginning of the next 60 years of friendship and frequent comradeship, and we shared the same house about 3 different times over those years. But Peter became very significant for me in 2 different ways. The first way was that at that time I was experiencing difficulties about my relationship to the Catholic Church and a certain amount of moral confusion about trying to live the good life. Peter was the one person who was extremely helpful to me at that period and became a kind of monitor in that respect. But But it was also the beginning of a political comradeship, because we were invited to address the freshers at an orientation week event. I think it was in 1967. The result of which was a savagely attacking news column in the Courier Mail the following day that was headed something like "Junior Lecturers Attack Senior Staff." There's no category called junior lecturers, but that was the attitude of the Courier Mail, and it was an attitude shared in by a lot of people in Brisbane at the time. But that led to an increasing connection with the nascent student movement, so that Peter and I were both members of the Newman Society. And the Newman Society at that time was fairly important. It was the time of the Vietnam War, it was the time of conscription, and the Newman Society was the cockpit of struggle between left-wing Catholics, and even a group that identified themselves as Catholic atheists on the one hand, and proponents of the National Civic Council on the other. And it led to a strong connection with the group that became known as SDA, Students for Democratic Action, or Society for Democratic Action. That led to a long series of political events in which we both participated. But if I were to stress those serious kind of elements in Peter, I'd be giving a completely wrong picture of him, because he was one of the funniest people that I've ever met. He had a cat whose familiar name was Clausy, and he was a huge black and white cat, more like a kind of a junior tiger, than the domestic animal we call cats. Well, that wasn't the main thing about Clausy. In the context of rather pretentious academics, when they met Clausy, he was always introduced as Dr. Claus Mendelbitz. I forget which university in Germany he came from, probably Heidelberg, or it could have been Wertheim. But he was the professor, according to Peter, of Sanskrit and underwater psychology. Now that was one of the typical remarks that you might hear at any time of the morning or afternoon from Peter. He had an incredibly inventive and imaginative mind, and he was always producing phenomena of that kind. His humour was also slanted satirically at our political targets. I remember once when both the English department in which I worked and philosophy in which he worked were in the Hartley-Teakle building. Now, the Hartley-Teakle building is a fair way from the refectory, and as you went up at lunchtime to go to the refectory, you passed by an area in which suddenly there appeared a kind of vast wooden frame. And nobody could tell you what that frame was there for, but it was interesting to see whether people walked through it or walked around it. Anyway, Peter tolerated this for a few days, but then as we walked up, he grabbed hold of the frame and put it well out of the way. And the following day it was replaced, and that happened for 3 days. And eventually, an objection was lodged against Peter for this, because this was a sanctioned experiment that was being conducted by somebody in the psychology department. They said Peter was interfering with university research. And Peter Dillon reasonably said, if you want to know what people are going to do about the frame, and if you think that the only two choices are walking through it or not walking through it, now you know that there's a third possibility. Now, I don't know whether in subsequent years anyone has ever done a PhD in philosophy examining whether empirical psychology works with assumptions or whether it doesn't. But it would be a great outcome of Peter's satire if that were to occur. Peter also was a star in the review that some of you may even remember in the Avalon Theatre called Itchingly Twitchingly, which was directed by Brian Toohey. And Peter made up some wonderful songs for that review and sang them, one of which was, had a chorus, "The Bohemians are blooming again." It was about wonderful, wonderful Brisbane. Peter was completely unpretentious, but the new Vice-Chancellor to the university who arrived in the course of a very vigorous student movement, probably the most vigorous student movement in Australia with the possible exception of the one at Monash, which was kind of madly Maoist. Zelman Cowen thought that he would charm these radicals into compliance by his well-known liberal views and so on. That proved not to be the case. And I remember meetings at which Zelman would be there and others, including radicals, would be there. Peter had the habit of continually calling him the Zellbird or Zelmo. And of course this wasn't appreciated by possibly one of the vainest men in Australia at that time. Peter could also conjure up out of airy nothings extraordinary imaginary beings, and there were many of them, and he gave them names that were also hilarious. But the most memorable one for me was a man who was fighting on behalf of people who, like himself, did not exist. One was familiar, of course, with the movement of physically disabled people and psychologically disabled people, but Peter was interested in people who were metaphysically challenged by not existing. Now, I wish I could remember this guy's name, but I can't, and I'm sure you could put that down as one of the typical offences of metaphysically able people against those who do not exist. But that was the kind of thing that Peter was always doing. Another thing that he did, he was a notorious cat person, so his relationship with dogs were very interesting to observe. Now, my brother Michael's family had a wonderful little dog called Atticus, who was about 1 foot long, a sort of a mongrelized Pomeranian, but conceived himself to be a great defender of the house. Now, the first time that Peter arrived with me to visit, Atticus went bonkers completely. But it was wonderful to observe Peter engaging in dialogue with Atticus, in which he was eventually charming him out of this aggressive hostility into a form of placable interspecies communication. Those are some of the main memories that I have of Peter. I suppose the Peter I'm speaking of is not the Peter represented in the photographs that you've seen so far. The Peter I'm talking about was a young man or a middle-aged man and I think a considerable public figure in the history of Queensland at that time. I'll just mention some of the events without going into them thoroughly. We conceived an organisation called the URG, which was the University Reform Group, and that was based on the perception that the University of Queensland wasn't at that time conducting itself as a completely responsible and intellectual university should, and the URG led to a significant movement, I think, eventually within the UQ student movement that produced the book Up the Right Channels, which was a fairly considerable book written by about 100 staff and students, criticising the nature of university education, and in particular the University of Queensland, department by department, through about 40 of the departments. And I think it stood out in the student movements of that period as taking seriously the role of the university, both in abstract terms of what an intellectual community should be, but also in terms of the university being shaped more and more to be the servant of capitalism and the servant of even imperialism. If you looked at some of the research that was being done and it was used in things like the Vietnam War and so on. So Peter was responsible, I think, for initiating that sort of thing. Peter also went to jail after refusing to pay a fine for the big Civil Liberties March in 1967. And possibly the most spectacular thing that he did was at a certain point to put a motion of no confidence in Zelman Cowan, the university's Vice-Chancellor, which was notable for calling out what is probably still the largest number of staff to a University Staff Association meeting, with the University Staff Association, a precursor of the NTEU. The motion lost, but I think it really gave a jolt to the official university at a time when it badly needed it. One other result of that university involvement was that for a considerable period of time, the de facto running of some of the departments included students. The English department was run for a fair while by a general assembly of 100 people, 50 of whom were staff and 50 of whom were students, and the philosophy department was in a similar case, due not only to Peter, but also to Ian Henkfus, whose son Kim, I notice, is here today. One other and possibly more enduring achievement of Peter's was to get involved with radical black activists and to take the Indigenous history of Australia very seriously. And in more recent years, Peter reacted to the event of the Twin Towers in 2001 with the feeling that we were entering a period of history in which we needed to have serious political and cultural discussions. So, with my assistance, he founded a group that continues called the 17 Group. Well, I could go on at considerable length about all these things, but I want to conclude by trying to suggest what strikes me as the distinctive kind of motivation of Peter. Peter Peter is one of two quite remarkable men that I've known, philosophers, who've lived into their mid-90s. And the other one, probably also known to some of you, is Ted Verso, called Ted because his mother thought that Australians would have difficulty with his real name. He was a Sicilian, Salvatore D'Urso. Salvatore D'Urso was a member of the CPA in the 1940s, and he was one of the first people to leave the CPA on principle in the 40s rather than after Hungary or Czechoslovakia later on. And he wound up in Trotskyist groups, and then as the nature of the world darkened into our present period, I think I've described Ted, a continuing Marxist of some kind, as a pessimistic revolutionary or revolutionary pessimist. When I think about Ted and ask myself what motivated Ted, I think I have to go back further than the 19th century, when the major kind of radical macroscopic views of the world emerged, of Marxism and anarchism. I think in the case of Ted, one has to go back further to Socrates, because the first time I ever visited Ted's house, and I did it on a frequent basis thereafter, I was struck by the number of books that he had, but whenever you opened one of the books, you found marginal notes or underlinings. And it struck me at that time that Ted was the living exemplar of that famous quote from Socrates, that the unexamined life is not worth living. And it seemed to me that that was the deep foundation of Ted's thought and activism. Now, Peter is both similar to Ted and different from Ted. And in Peter's case too, I want to go back to Socrates. If you examine Peter's trajectory, once again alluding to something Chris has said, Peter was one of the founders of dissent, and I think dissent in the 50s was a representative in Australia of the British New Left, which was a new left emerging to the left of the Labor Party. Peter then in the 60s became, along with a number of us who are probably in this room at this moment as well, became a member of the New Left, but a different New Left, a New Left that emerged from the United States. And then I think Peter reached back further than the founding of any of those nations to which that mode of critique might apply, into the 10, 20, 30, 40, 60,000 years in which human beings had lived in this country in a way that respected the country and provided the basis of communal living. So that Peter too, I think, like Ted, reached back beyond the 19th century, beyond Marxism, beyond anarchism, into the kind of issues raised in the ancient world, again by Socrates, but now I think the issues were, how does one live a good life? And that's a perennial question that we can pose to ourselves at any time. And I suppose we pose that question to ourselves, but it's a question whether any of us live that good life that we conceive in theory and in faith. And I think that question can be posed about Peter as well. I don't want to present Peter as any kind of total exemplar for living or any kind of saint or guru, because I don't think he had that kind of status. But if you think of the Socrates of the Nicomachean Ethics, or the Socrates who constantly engaged people in dialogue and made them think in a way that they weren't willing to think, that, I think, is one of the things about Peter. And perhaps, finally, I could invoke not Socrates, but Socrates' greatest pupil, Plato. Because Plato once said about life that time is the image, is the moving image of eternity. I hope that Peter has moved from that moving image into the eternity of which our life is the image. I hope that he hasn't found there that he is one of the people who don't exist. And if he runs into that guy, whose name unfortunately I can't remember, I hope he gives him some kind of comfort as a responsible and still metaphysically able person.
I understand it is now time for a song. And there's an anecdote to go with this song. And I can find it. While the tiggies get ready to play it. Now I don't know if life isn't meant to be easy or life wasn't meant to be easy, because I've seen both titles, but we'll find out shortly. Now the anecdote which Janine sent me, sorry, I've forgotten the...
Dan sent it, so he could probably say...
Oh, well, anyway, it's from someone who was a waiter in New York, I believe. Let me try to read it.
Does Mary
This is
know
not...
the story?
Frank Millwood.
What is it?
I'm Frank Millwood.
Thank you. Okay. Oh dear, sorry, the light again. It's part of the Gough Whitlam archives, as I gave him the 45 MP disc when I was working as a waiter at the Algonquin Hotel in New York. He was working as a waiter.
Would you like Mary just to tell the story? You don't know.
I want Mary to tell the story.
Well, Frank was a musician who knew Peter and worked, and when he heard about Peter's passing, sent these two songs that I understand, I'm just repeating what was in the email that Peter had written, and they had recorded together in some way that escapes me. So this is Peter's work.
And apparently Gough Whitlam played a lot at many gatherings.
Yes, part of the story is, we'll name what as best we can here. And as Gough Whitlam said, we have dialed out on that disc a number of times. So, let's hear it.
When the sun shines brightly in the morning, when the surf turns over in the bay, when the flowers shoot up in the springtime, you know it wasn't meant to be that way. When children gather together to romp and sing their lives away, when lovers and friends enjoy joyous weekends, you know that they are being led astray. 'Cause life wasn't meant to be easy, life wasn't meant to be gay, life was meant to be hard, life was meant to be grey. Life wasn't meant to be easy, life was meant to be sad. Life was meant to be bad. try to get yourself a pay rise to keep that cost of living wolf at bay. You can bet your bottom dollar and a dollar more as well that wealthy Mal will fight it all the way. When you can't get work but still you keep on trying, when you live the best you can on nothing pay, they will kick you when you're down, say don't bludger, you're a clown. That's getting a fair go in Malcolm's way. Life wasn't meant to be easy. Life wasn't meant to be gay. Life was meant to be hard. Life was meant to be grey. Life wasn't meant to be easy. Life was meant to be sad. Life was meant to be bad. Life wasn't meant to be easy. No, life wasn't meant to be easy. Life wasn't meant to be easy. No, 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 no. Oh, life wasn't meant to be easy. No, no, life wasn't meant to be easy. No, no, no.
Mary Graham is coming on, so fair just again, pardon my pronunciation of is it Cumberland? Thanks, woman on the Gold Coast, that's through her father's lineage, and affiliated with the Waka Waka, South Burnett, who was the mother speaking. Philosophy friend, adjunct professor at the School of Political Science and International Studies.
I've got a poem, a lamentation for the dead. I wrote some time ago. I and one or two other Aboriginal people were trying or are trying to write sort of like liturgies, you know, to do with the dead dying, but based on Aboriginal terms of reference, you know. So this one and others not necessarily mentioning God or heaven or things like that, Jesus, because the very old system, the ancient system, didn't have any God or gods or heaven or hell. They didn't exist. Those things. It's not in the mindset. The Aboriginal people, of course, there are thousands of Christians now, you know, nowadays, and some Muslims actually, Aboriginal Muslims. But I just very briefly want to say I actually learned a lot from Peter, especially about, I was never a student of philosophy, I think I did politics myself, but I met him through my good friend Lila Watson, who was friends with him beforehand. She couldn't be here, she's kind of not well. But he taught me a lot about the Greek thinking. I had a go at it when I was very young, just because it was helpful in clinical science and that. But I couldn't get into it, and I linked more towards non-European thinking actually. So Chinese, Indian, you know, other people. I could identify closer with that. The thing I couldn't get into in Greek thinking, or European thinking, was the logic. Didn't make any sense to me as an Aboriginal person, because of course, you know, gradually, you know, you do learn that while we didn't have a European style philosophy, we did have our own logic. You couldn't be this old without having our own logic, you know, Aboriginal people. But he was, I just want to say, he really was all those things people have been talking about. But for me, he was also like a brother, actually, because I should say now, lots of brothers, and they were all tall, very big, strong fellows. You know, he reminded me of a brother, actually, exactly like that, you know, and very, you know, protective and strong, and Just very, and funny too, you know. So he was just simply one of the best people I've known. Anyway, so this is a lamentation, and quite often it's supposed to be like sunny, you know, it's like a song or something like that. Starting off, the ancestors are coming to take us home. The ancestors are coming with story and more, with music and dance, with greetings and laughter from their old sacred land, from our old dear country. We'll greet our ancestors with singing and feasting, with tears and remembering, happiness and sorrow, alas and hurrah, for our old sacred land, for our old dear country. The ancestors are here. Their spirits now resting, watched over by spirits of land, nourished by the great life force, in the old sacred land, in the old dear country. The ancestors are going, taking our dear Peter with them, taking our beloved back home, back to old ancestors waiting, with laments, shouts, with goodbyes and farewells. The sacred Lord, safe with his ancestors, to rest, to sleep, to dream, to live forever and ever in the old sacred land, in the old dear country. So that's all. Thanks.
So Rita Henry on Fred, Skyward Fred, poets, and the theatre puppet maker, performer, dreamer, a learner of stuff, and she's going to read a poem.
Hello everyone. This is apparently one of Peter's favourite poems. It's called The Death of a Bird by A.D. Hope. For every bird there is this last migration. Once more the cooling year kindles her heart with a warm passage to the summer station. Love pricks the course in lights across the chart. Year after year, a speck on the map, divided by a whole hemisphere, summons her to come. Season after season, sure and safely guided, going away, she is also coming home. And being home, memory becomes a passion with which she feeds her brood and straws her nest, aware of ghosts that haunt the heart's possession, and exiled love mourning within the breast. The sands are green with a mirage of valleys. The palm tree casts a shadow not its own. Down the long architrave of temple or palace blows a cool air from moorland scarps of stone. And day by day the whisper of love grows stronger, a delicate voice, more urgent with despair. Custom and fear constraining her no longer, drives her at last on the waste leagues of air. A vanishing speck in those inane dominions, single and frail, uncertain of her place, alone in the bright host of her companions, lost in the blue unfriendliness of space. She feels it close now, the appointed season. The invisible thread is broken as she flies. Suddenly, without warning, without reason, the guiding spark of instinct winks and dies. Try as she will, the trackless world delivers no way, the wilderness of light no sign. The immense and complex map of hills and rivers mocks her small wisdom with its vast design. And darkness rises from the eastern valleys, and the winds buffet her with their hungry breath, and the great earth, with neither grief nor malice, receives the tiny burden of her death.
Julia Klein is going to speak, and has been given a quick word. Friend, teacher, young person of today. How about that?
By the time Peter came into the life of myself and my three older brothers, Stuart, Sean and Mitchell, Peter had about 7 years of life under his belt. Although his life impacted others in a variety of ways, often positive, sometimes complicated, his impact on our lives was gentle and unintrusive. To our memory, he would probably be best summed up by an image of him sitting on a chair, beanie, scarf and fabulous trousers. Sitting in this chair, Peter would listen without judgment, give sage advice after much thorough and physical contemplation, and then proceed to make some strange Peter sound to bring some joy. He entered our life as a strange man with the long socks, and off he went as the wise friend with the rainbow scarf. I've also got a message to pass on from my niece, Lucy, who wanted to say that her favourite memory of Peter is all the stories he would tell and all the music that he would make with her, which segues nicely into the short collection of videos that we've put together of Peter connecting and bringing much delight to the young people in his life, many of whom are here today.
His friend is very best mate. So he's going to do that, what all he's done. And he lives in Australia.
In, and then the father got in, and then the baby got in, and they're all having a wash together. That's in the baby. And then who's this? Is that Uncle Jimmy? Well, he's not allowed in the bath, is he? Oh, he's in, they're all in the bath. It's a big bath, very big bath. And now.
Did you film it? People using all these drugs in the car. Are you filming?
Yeah, of course.
Here comes the bell, all going to hell. Here comes the bell, it's just as well. Here comes Chloe, making the noise of the Chloe. Here comes Peter, looking for us, and Peter, on the it won't go.
Now, in our language, that wouldn't be a cardigan. That would be a...
A cardigan.
Yes, it is a cardigan, I know that. But in our language, you and I, we're making up a language. It'd be a... No. Our language is much more bodily than cardigan's all right. But you've got to admit that...
Hi everyone, I'm Annie, I'm Peter's daughter. I thank him for all that he was able to give, all his beautiful qualities, and his love and joy in me that was so freely available in his old age. I was happy that he was now happier and able to love and be loved. He was my dad, and I will miss him.
I'm Stephen. I am reading this letter on behalf of my mother and some of my siblings. Hello everyone. Some of you will remember me. I am Barbara, Peter's former wife and the mother of his 6 children. Peter was a charismatic, intelligent, funny man. I was once deeply in love with him, and I understand why so many people have such fond memories. However, there was another part that was very damaged as a result of the traumas in his early life. And this manifested as an inability to cope with being a husband and a father in a family of 6 children. He was often immobilised by depression and at times filled with rage. For a long time, out of loyalty to Peter, I did not speak about the unhappiness and fear in our home. I was also concerned to protect his public image. This is not an uncommon family scenario. Unfortunately, his behaviour affected some of our children deeply. Then, in 1978, when the eldest were 18 and the youngest 13, Peter left his job and effectively abandoned all responsibility for his children. I have agonised over this statement, but having discussed it with my children, Margaret and Christine, we decided it is important for our well-being that along with remembering the good things about Peter, there is also a recognition of his behaviour as a husband and a parent. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Janine. I'm Peter's partner. Our relationship going back nearly 23 years. I first met Peter at a reconciliation course that our local community centre, Sandgate, was running in the late 90s. I knew nothing of him. All I knew was that he was charming and interesting, challenged many of us in the course, and had a very distinctive style of dressing. From the start, there was a gravitational pull towards each other. Who knows why these things happen? I was a mother of 4 children, finishing my degree and ready to start a new chapter in my life. Had you asked me, would it be with someone who was older than my father, I would have said no. While 9/11 became a defining moment in history, as Dan spoke about, it also marked the beginning of what was to become a very loving and enduring friendship. A relationship and friendship, thank you. The garden is where I came to know Peter in a deeper sense. In the early 2000s, he came to help me create a beautiful garden at Human Port, where I was living. Many months, much digging and much planting. I enjoyed gardening and preferred gardens more wild than pruned, but I had no idea of the grand vision Peter had and was well known for, creating the 400 trees planted at Dutton Park near the Green Bridge, the rainforest garden at Younger Street where he used to live, numerous candlenut and cotton trees planted at Curlew Park, and of course the 6 fig trees at Shorncliffe Waterfront in remembrance of his brother. Every morning I would hear Peter greet the plants and each new growth he lovingly encouraged, each struggling growth tended. Even when we moved to our new home in Esther Street, and despite the limitations of gouty hands and ebbing energy, Peter created a botanical piece of art. He loved to gift his plants to anyone who was interested, and there were many. With every plant came a particular type of conversation. Each plant was imbued with some sort of special meaning to the recipient. And there's quite a few of you here today. I think Murtug and Husna ended up walking away with quite a lot of plants unexpectedly. Our home and garden became an open door in which many friends and family came to sit and relax, to share poetry and music, to gather for communal meals, or to discuss and debate ideas big and small. People clocked in and out, and many would stop to have one of those meaningful conversations, often full of his humour. We believe that change came at an interpersonal level. It was very different from that at the university life where large numbers gathered, but in our smaller, more intimate things, those conversations also made a huge difference to the people we were spending time with. And as we all know, change ripples out to many people. At 91, Peter was even invited to speak at the Woodford. Do you know what? Sorry, I have jumped. I should have had my thing in order. It provided both of us, and especially Peter, with the nourishment his mind and spirit needed. So, we both acknowledged that our difference in age would bring different energies and abilities, hence our shared projects. Our work, Peter would often refer to it as, became a deeply enriching aspect of our time together. We both had a mutual desire to build community, to share wisdom. Underpinning what we did was a mutual understanding that Aboriginal perspectives would always be part of our ventures. We made a good team in that we came at things in different ways. Peter approached life with big picture ideas, taking people to various philosophical and spiritual thought, and I saw the practical things that needed to be done to develop these into our shared projects. We started the Year for Peace in Sandgate, a 2-year project that welcomed all and challenged many, looking at the different cultural and historical factors that impact on our individual and collective lives. Next came Journey Lines, which lasted 4 years with some gaps in between. It brought a handful of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people together to discuss issues and ideas entirely from Aboriginal terms of reference. There was much laughter, eating and serious reflection on the nature of our humanity and the ignorance of our history. Peter, along with Mary Graham and Arnie Villa-Watson, brought our conversations to a higher level, and no one was left without feeling much had been accomplished. It impacted on everything I did and said outside of that meeting, rippling out to touch others. And really, I just want to add here, and I think Mary and Lynn and would say that there was much laughter. And if you ever planning to go on a diet, it was impossible because there was just so much food. And we would talk for hours, and a number of different people would come in and out of that meeting at different times in different months. With the help of many friends, we held an exhibition of Peter's quirky art, taken from the images he had drawn on a handmade calendar, located in the toilet, a gift from early. We had a little table of pens and people could sit while they're on the toilet. And if you look up the back, you'll see that it'd be worth having a look at the calendars that Uli made us for 3 years running, and the different little images Peter wrote and thoughts everybody had. It became quite a nice place to visit, actually. We called our work Luarte Collective because some, as Peter would say, would call it shithouse art. It was also a collective because the amount of people that also helped us get that project together. The t-shirt Bonner was showing you at the beginning with one of Peter's little drawings that we extracted from the calendar, and the quote, which was a quote Peter always used. But the actual design of that was done by my daughter-in-law, Jarina, who helped with some of our things, and there were many people that did that. So, you know, Peter, it was never a thing of an individual, just us doing it. It was always many people bringing something together. Later, I learned to screen print and put the images onto t-shirts. The really, really neat ones I were done professionally, I must admit, the faulty ones up there are the ones I did, with meaningful quotes that Peter always cited and which we sold at the markets. He was a popular figure, and many would stop to have one of those meaningful conversations, often full of his humour. And once again, we believe that change came at an interpersonal level. Now, I'm assuming in the 60s and 70s, and for all the work that Peter did, no one would have imagined he'd be sitting at a market stall. taken on this Socratic-like figure, but he really did make a difference, you know. The conversations could be very, very small, but they were full of meaning. Peter had a phenomenal memory, and he could pull out quotes or ideas or tell, as I think Bonner referred to, parables. There was always a story that was relevant to the person he was talking to, and they would leave and then maybe come back at different times. And, you know, a small group of people started collecting these T-shirts. And my sister had also made up a website where Peter would talk about the meaning of those quotes. So we had blogs, and it's not like thousands of people, not even hundreds of people accessed it, but it was a really integral part of our relationship, because in that partnership we were talking to each other all the time about these ideas, and then, you know, doing something in a practical way. I did the practical things, Peter wasn't really up to that. At 91, he was even invited to speak at the Woodford Folk Festival by Michael Donovan, who also assisted me in learning helping me with a business course, in his wife Ludmilla, of which case I wasn't very good and we didn't make any money at all. But I will show you Sean, do you want to do? My son has a very stressful job of doing PowerPoints that have no sense of order. It's not going to work. Oh, that's a shame. It's all right. No, it doesn't matter. No, if you're really desperate to see it, you let me know and I'll send it to you. In the last 2 years of Peter's life, with his health, strength and energies further waning, the Zeldin Group brought together many of those ideas that Peter strived for, creating community and sharing insights and wisdom through telling us stories of how we came to where we are now. It was neither political nor religious, yet those themes were explored in the telling of each story. Now the Zeldin Group, we called it the Zeldin Group, it was based on a book that Bonner had gifted us by the philosopher Theodore Zeldin, and they were essays. And we brought together a whole group of, when I say whole group, there was between 8 and 12, sometimes up to 14 of us. And people didn't know each other. Some people knew each other, but we thought, why don't we bring together a diverse group of people and let's hear what they've got to say. One of the interesting things in it, though, that a number of people, like two of them, Pam and Dawn, who'd come from South Africa, turns out in one of their many moves from South Africa and that to uni, knew Merv. And Bonner knew another one, John Foster, who was brought up in the circus and was educated around the campfire. Yet Bonner worked with one of John Foster's, one of the Ashtons that John knew. And he said, well, if you were going to explain that type of linking, you could look at, say, reincarnation as a way of explaining it. It was not that Peter sat there and thought, there's reincarnation, but it was a possibility to explain how we could get together a whole lot of people we didn't think knew each other and then find that there were connections there. And, you know, within this group, we just got an area of the book, a particular theme, and then we talked about our lives. And John Ransby was one of those too. And how we came to understand what it is. And it really was a sharing of wisdom and insight. And I think all of us have stayed quite close friends from that. Our last project was not completed. To produce Wisdom, or another title, or Humanity, a musical with Greek chorus. Peter loved Greek chorus, and we'd already been starting to take notes down since 2022, because by this time Peter's hands were so deformed with the tophi gout that he couldn't really write well. But the energy that flowed out of his hands, as ulcerated and as huge as they were, was actually always a really beautiful energy that never ever went. So just leading to talk about how he died and then what we, what were the highlights for me out of it. Peter had been in hospital for a month and he was out 5 days. On his last day, he was so pleased to be out. We drove around Sandgate. He didn't drive, but anyway. We drove around Sandgate and, I wrote down Peter's thoughts on that. He picked out all the beautiful things around the area, the different places we'd been, and had wonderful experiences. And then on the last day, he hadn't been very well. He'd woken up in the morning. An interesting thing about this, he said something that he hadn't normally said. He had many things he cited or chanted from a lot of Indian spiritual thing because Nityananda had been a turning point in his life. But he didn't follow any particular set religious institution. He was past all that. But he woke up that morning saying, Mary, Mother of Jesus, help me. And then he talked about wanting to free his heart, his mind, of all the things that gave him pain, but also that it caused pain to other people. And the day went on, and I had to go out and pick my granddaughters up and just take them swimming, and Stevie had been sitting with Peter, who wouldn't move out of the chair till I got home. I got home, we had half an hour, we spoke. Peter talked about how much he loved me and our life together. He said he was a little sad that not everything in his life had been resolved, and asked would I wash him. And I took him to the bathroom and I washed him down with the special hospital lights they had. And he said, I think I'm going to faint. And he did. He sat in his chair, and that was it. A few more minutes later, and he was dead. Stevie came, his son Stevie came and helped me move Peter onto the bed, and paramedics came and we did all wonderful things. But at the end of it, Peter was laid out in the bed looking so peaceful. He would have been so pleased that he was at home. But one of the most beautiful things was, Dan sort of described it as an Irish wake when he walked in. There was much laughter, there was drinking, there was food, there was people coming in and out of the room. Bella played on her ocarina some music. Georgia did a Zen meditation over him. People just came and sat. People who were fearful of seeing a dead body, were very relaxed. We had one of our neighbours who was a bit nervous of that, and by the end of Peter was peaceful. There was Stevie and I and Julia, my daughter, and Uli, our friend, and Stephanie, and by this time Stephanie was sitting on the bed beside Peter. And so it was everything that Peter would have wanted. The community coming together and lots of love. So to conclude this appreciation of Peter's life, what are the highlights for me and the things that I most remember? What do I treasure about our relationship? One of the things, when you think about who Peter was, and as I said, I didn't know who Peter was, and it actually took many, many years to actually realise what he was, who he was. It just didn't all spill out. I did this, I did this, I did this. I just had to pick up bits and pieces because Peter didn't really discuss his life in that way. He was just Peter, who was quite complex and quite complicated at other levels. But one of the things I know Peter often talked about with me was my kindness. Kindness was incredibly important to Peter. He loved to watch me walk a journey with many different people in my role and work in Indigenous communities and through programs I run at the university. And that's why he often called it our work. It wasn't my work, because my work also was the things that we both found important, just even outside of work. And Peter's discussions with me about a range of things informed also how I would then go in and approach the work I did through the university. He valued the tenderness that we shared between us. He acknowledged that there were actions of his that had caused suffering to others, and he owned the pain of this. And there was lots of pain. It wasn't as if when Peter and I met that these things didn't become apparent as we went along, but Peter was already well and truly upon a spiritual journey where things were changing, and he was trying to find ways to find a more peaceful life. I mean, one of the things he would say, and he meant that, love is the essence of life. And one of the things was gratitude, and the more older Peter got, the more gratitude he showed. He was grateful for our neighbour next door that would come and bring him news of what was happening in the activist centre. He would be delighted when a friend came. He was full of gratitude that this friend, John Mears, would travel down from Stanford quite regularly to go over and discuss literature. And there's a lovely, and I'd like to share this because one of the things in all this gratitude that Peter felt was also the aspect of him that didn't look at people as they were up here or they were down there. Everybody was equal. He went off to meet Max Charlesworth when he was in town one time. There was some fancy place where Max was staying, and he went off in his flannel pants with big red socks and a scarf, and I thought, oh my goodness, you're going to walk in there like that. He didn't care, you know, that was Peter. But there's a lovely image I have of Dan and Peter and Murray came over once to have one of their discussions, and while I was fixing lunch because I was going to go out, they started off with a conversation around Einstein, and because I've lost some of my notes, I can't remember the wording of the quote without absolutely murdering it, so I won't bother saying it. And it led on to Plato and Aristotle, and I think as I was walking out the door, Marxism came in. 5 hours later I came back, and Dan, Murray and Peter were they were sitting in this little circle, probably because Peter and Dan had hearing problems too, but it was this lovely close little circle. 5 hours. Peter was 94 then, I think. And when they left, Peter just said, I feel so blessed that I have friends like this that can come and sit with me. It meant a lot to him, and, you know, at an intellectual level, you know, that type of thing feeds you. And then I take you to another thing that happened, where we went up to visit some family up in Kilcoy. And, you know, there's struggles to make ends meet. My nephew, Jacob, worked at the meat works then. But in that whole day of interacting with everyone, he would ask Jacob, what did he think? Jacob would tell him quite clearly about what was happening at the meat works and how they were trying to fill them with good words and kind words about how great they were as staff. In the meantime, you know, things weren't that great there. And Peter once again got in the car, and he was so grateful that he could spend time, you know, with family or friends or whatever, and learn about people. And that was probably one of the things Peter always learned from others. And another thing too, and I think this makes reference to a few things that Dan spoke about just briefly, and Stevie felt, and for Annie too, that Peter really did at times his depression and melancholy would come upon him. He was getting better at finding ways of getting out of it, but he would be very tortured do I love? Am I capable of loving? Where's this anger? Why is it anger? Do I have ego? I have ego. There was a lot of things that went through Peter's mind. And what we do, Peter often spoke about the David Hume moments, and it was in reference to the philosopher David Hume, when absolutely tortured, would go off and play backgammon with friends and spend a few hours with it, and then he would come back and think, what was all the fuss about? So at some point Peter would pick himself up and say, come on, we'll do what David Hume did. And we would drive to the water or the mountains and sit quietly taking in the beauty and peace. Many of you would have heard Peter describe the sensation on seeing certain landscapes, the desire to just lie down and die at the foot of the mountains under the shade of a tree. It was not meant to be morbid, but a reflection of the deep connection he had to the land and the notion of eternal peace. And so, with this, I do want to actually mention something else, because this is going back to before when he died, and it was a particularly moving moment for Peter. Was the Threshold Singers who came before he died, and I don't know whether you know them, but they're an international movement where they come in and they don't really talk to you. They come in, they sit for 20 minutes, they sing beautiful harmonies. In this case, there were three: Christine, Vanna, Anne Harriet, and Birmingham. They had been going to go up to the hospital, but Peter came home, and they just circled him and sang, and Peter fell into a very deep and peaceful sleep that he hadn't had for quite a long time. So I did want to mention that. So the last thing I think I would like to leave you with was Peter's concept of the internet. And I can't think when Peter started calling it the internet, he had thought a lot about it in relation to people connecting on the internet. But he was intrigued by the concept of the internet and in spreading wisdom. For him, the internet was a way of communicating with others, where problems could be solved and love could be found. For Peter, this is where the gift of our intuition takes precedence over that of our rational mind. And for him, he would often tell people, we will always be there on the internet. And, you know, the other saying he always had, I'm more powerful in the subtle than the gross. And I think when you think of Peter's death and the ideas and all the stories about Peter and his spiritual beliefs, of which they're all marked, not all of them obviously, the quotes that underpin much of his life, that hopefully he's hoping that you're actually communicating with him and he's communicating with you on the internet. So, thank you. I just want to say, because I know Chris thought this too many, I can't, work it out, and it would be to say thank you, because this would not have happened without many people helping me, and this is what Peter loved: cooperation and community. So I know it's going to be hard not to miss people, so I'm not going to mention anybody's names, but we've had the displays, we've had the kitchen, we have the sound, and PowerPoints, and also the use of the hall, and here I am going to say something here, because Sterling is our state member of Parliament who also knew Peter and had conversations with him, and Sterling, was one of who enabled us to be able to have this hall without cost. So thank you, Sterling.
going to round off with a song from Gurrimal,